Has American business finally tuned in, trimmed down, and wised up to winning in the international market? New trade figures point to a turnaround in the U.S. trade deficit, but Congress is sounding the protectionist alarm. How can American business be kept healthy without risking a global trade war?
We should be focusing on how do we make American companies more competitive, how do we foster commitment to overseas markets, and how do we foster a commitment to quality and technological leadership.
But can American companies win if they can't get in the game overseas?
The time has come where we're going to have a lever in order to pry open those markets, because they're not going to change their behavior, other countries, simply because we ask them to do so.
Winning in the global market. From Washington, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer, Inc. and these leading foundations. In our Washington studios, we'll hear from William Lilly, president of the American Business Conference, a coalition of mid-sized, high-growth American companies, and Pat Choate, director of policy analysis for TRW Incorporated. We'll hear from them in a moment, but first, let's look at the politics of international trade. On Capitol Hill, the long and bitter fight over trade legislation may be coming to an end. House Speaker Jim Wright predicts a vote by the end of March. To pass, a compromise must be reached on the controversial Gephardt Amendment, which requires the president to take action against countries that run up large trade surpluses with the United States. Democratic presidential hopeful Richard Gephardt has made tough trade legislation a central theme in his campaign, bringing his message to voters in television advertisements that place the blame for America's trade problems squarely at the door of our trading partners.
They work their hearts out every day trying to turn out a good product at a decent price. Then the Korean government slaps on 9 separate taxes and tariffs. And when that government's done, a $10,000 Chrysler K car costs $48,000 in Korea. It's not their fault we can't sell our cars in a market like that, and I'm tired of hearing American workers blamed for it.
The U.S. trade deficit totaled $171 billion in 1987, the 5th record-setting year in a row. Many say this is the price for America's commitment to free trade policy, a price that now is simply too high.
The United States has acted for very many years as if the practices that exist in the rest of the world were unimportant. They have regrettably become very, very important over the last 8 years. And the fact that we continue to rely on mythical market forces and free trade in a world where none of those things exist has created tremendous problems.
The most recent trade figures suggest that the situation may be turning around, helped by the falling value of the U.S. dollar. In December, the U.S. trade deficit narrowed to $12.2 billion, the lowest in 11 months. Opponents of new legislation fear that restrictions now could lead America's trading partners to retaliate, setting the scene for a trade war. A new report issued by the American Business Conference argues that some mid-sized companies are competing successfully overseas. The report points to companies like Genentech, the San Francisco-based healthcare firm, which is the first biotechnology company to develop, manufacture, and market its own product. Another successful competitor on the international scene is the Loctite Corporation, which turns new chemical technologies into breakthroughs in engineering adhesives and sealants. But not all of the companies in the report rely on high technology to gain a competitive advantage. Dunkin' Donuts has become the world's largest donut chain by adapting products and marketing to consumer preferences in countries as different as Colombia and Japan. According to James Pizer of Teradyne, a mid-sized high-tech company from Massachusetts, the future of American business lies in competing, not complaining.
Well, there may be some industries and some sectors that have legitimate claims of being treated unfairly by foreign governments, but I think in the end, trying to become competitive by retaliating against unfair practices or erecting our own trade barriers is going to fail. That you've got to concentrate on those fundamentals that make businesses successful, and those are technological leadership, long-term commitment to overseas markets, and quality.
The American Business Conference report stresses several common factors that contribute to a firm's international success. International expansion is integral to corporate strategy, not a sideline. Management exploits advantages in technology, marketing, and leadership, rather than cheap labor or economies of scale. They deny overseas rivals a sanctuary by bringing the international competition to the foreigner's home turf. And they actively recruit foreign nationals to build truly international talent pools. The report's prescriptions seem to point the way for American business to become truly competitive in the world market. But can the success of a relatively few mid-sized companies be replicated throughout the American business establishment?
Companies that have been successful in competing have done so in spite of unfair and discriminatory practices in other countries, not because those practices don't exist. If someone can make those adjustments, that's very good, but I think the question this country has to ask itself is whether the broad spectrum of economic activity in the United States can prosper and survive in the face of these kinds of unfair practices.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Morton Kondracki. Mr. Lilly, your report seems to say that American firms can compete in international commerce and that those who are advocating the Gephardt Amendment and protectionist measures, including corporate executives, are just whining. Is that a fair interpretation?
Well, I think that's a fair interpretation. I think the most damaging thing with the Gephardt Amendment and with other protectionist aspects of the House and Senate trade bills is the impression it's leaving on the American business community that it's terribly difficult, unfair, treacherous, dangerous, risky to do business abroad. These 100 companies in this organization, which go from donuts and cross pens, Jack Daniels whiskey, up to Cray supercomputers or Genentech, these companies went abroad when they were young, less than $10 million in sales. 65% were successful in the first year, 75% were successful in the second year. This is contrary to the conventional political wisdom and business school wisdom.
Okay, you're an advocate of measures such as this, and you claim that foreign barriers are the problem. What do you say to that?
Well, I say two things. One, I'd say that these are good companies, and certainly they're doing well, but they're small companies. They're serving a niche. And when you take a look at the report, what it is saying, as we just saw, is that a major part of their success is first of all, they locate a major part of their operations offshore. Secondly,
what do you mean by offshore?
Offshore. They locate it in the foreign country where they're selling it. Secondly, they hire foreign nationals to help manage and to operate. Our challenge as a country is how do we take American workers with factories in the United States, produce goods and services, and export them?
Okay,
Well,
what do you say?
First, these are not. The word niche implies a little tiny sliver. The average size of these companies is $400 million in sales per year. In any other economy in the world, that would be a very large company.
But what about his argument? What about his argument that basically you're employing foreigners and not Americans?
Now, there's two arguments. First, these companies, the success of these companies in everything from the most sophisticated down to the least sophisticated type of business, either goods producing or service type, their success shows that we have moved beyond a kind of mercantilist or national economy into what is really a borderless economy. These companies, while they do locate factories or have sales or distribution operations in other countries, they also every 5 years double their exports. They argue that to be able to export, you also have to have an operation in that country, so you're close to that customer in that country, so you can tailor your product.
But the question is, are these companies creating jobs for American workers?
These companies create per year, per company, 14% new jobs, and they claim that they are...
You know, that's all true, that's valid. These are good companies, they do a lot. I mean, America should be very proud of them. But you add them all up, and you still got about $40 billion of sales. Add them all up, all 100, and you're still doing a smaller amount of sales than IBM. These companies are going to do well in whatever kind of an environment that we're going to have in the country. I mean, you know, we can't update Engine Charlie Wilson to say what's good for ABC is good for America. What we've got to do is take a look and say, these companies are going to make it no matter what the circumstances.
Okay.
We need a different type of environment to do the exporting.
The question is, does what you've learned with these medium-sized companies apply to General Motors and IBM and TRW and all these other giant corporations?
Morton, I think the point is here is that when you look at businesses across, we even have a steel company, Chaparral Steel. Every kind of business except an automobile company is represented in this organization. The way they manage themselves, the way they have gone overseas and done this starting when they were small, is proof of the old Woody Allen line that 90% of success is showing up. The problem with American business, not American trade laws, is that too few of our companies are showing up overseas. Let me give you a good example. There are 5,000 registered consulting engineer companies in this country. Consulting engineers are a big drive point. If they get a contract abroad, they usually drive $15 or $20 American business for every dollar. Of those 5,000 in the last 10 years, only 750 at one time did business abroad. Last year, only 40 did business abroad. Too few of our companies are doing what Pat suggested, IBM or Pat's own company, are active overseas. My companies show that if you run yourself right, you can be successful.
My point is in many of the services that we want to do in finance, for example, we're just simply excluded from the market. In many of the industries, such as practicing law in Tokyo, it took literally government-to-government negotiations before we could even have our lawyers serve their clients in Tokyo.
Okay,
let's
not talk about apples and oranges, though. Don't switch to law firms. Talk about consulting engineers. I mean, he's saying...
Same thing.
Okay,
Same thing. It's services. You're talking about services.
But
services,
he's saying,
finance.
he's saying that big companies, big American companies, could compete in foreign commerce if they were innovative and if they tried.
Wait. Big American companies do compete. Big American companies constitute the majority of the exports that this country has. The challenge that we face is how do big American companies that are building superior products get those products into foreign markets where they are blocked out? We're not arguing, are we, that there are not foreign trade barriers here?
I believe there are foreign trade barriers, but they're a very small part of the problem and the last part of the problem. If you look at our export, 85% of those, 250 companies account for 85% of our exports. We would argue, based on this report, that if bigger companies, smaller companies, middle-sized companies change the way they did business abroad, not tried to go into Italy or France and do it exactly the way you did it in the United States, you could be successful.
Just a second. Now, you say that what percentage of America's trade deficit is due to the foreign trade barriers that are erected? What percentage? 20%?
No, there's two numbers.
50%?
There's two numbers that are run out. The number that's commonly thrown around is 20%. The Department of Commerce in the early 80s did a study that said it could be as much as 30 or 40%. Take 20%. 20% is $30 billion.
Is it
That's
20%?
a lot of money.
What is it?
Well,
Pick a number.
The Congressman Gephardt, who you mentioned, said on the floor in the debate on his bill that it was 15%. That was the number he used. I think let's assume that Pat's right, that it's 20% and it's $30 billion. And let's assume tomorrow that the next president, and it's Gephardt, waves a wand and all those barriers are removed tomorrow. That doesn't get us $1 of American business. The companies have to be in there doing that, even if the barriers are removed.
Let's shift here. Right now, we've got the dollar declining, the trade deficit is going down, the exports are going up. Isn't this problem going to solve itself? Doesn't this prove that the dollar was the problem?
No. What happens is you can cheapen your goods a little bit and you'll pick up some business. That's certainly happening. But then you go back and you take a look at, you find out that a major part of your manufacturing activities functions are running at full capacity. If they're to go to the next step, if you're really to drive it down, then they've got to be willing to make substantially increased investments in new facilities. Who would want to do that today, given the wild fluctuations that you've had in the exchange rate? So no, what will happen is I think that you can drop the yen to 100. I think you can pass any protectionist measure you want. I think that you can do any other set of measures under traditional orthodox economics, and we're still going to run an $80 or $90 billion trade deficit.
That's a lot better than it is now.
It's a lot better, but it is still a historic high. What it really means that we've got to do is we may have to have the dollar down, but there are other measures we're going to have to take.
What do you say about the improvement, the apparent improvement in exports?
I think that the real question goes to what these 100 executives in these well-run companies, what they feel the problem is. Now, we've polled them extensively. McKinsey & Company did this. They think there are two much bigger barriers abroad than government-imposed barrier. The first barrier is the perception, most strongly held in the common market in Japan, that American goods and services are of inferior quality to the goods and services produced locally in those countries. The second biggest barrier, they believe, is the inability of American companies when they go abroad to modify their product and modify their marketing and distribution to accommodate the business code. They think that is 85% of the problem.
Okay, let's pause now to consider the argument that our problem is not with American products, but with American trade policy?
At the heart of American trade policy is membership in the international accord known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Today, 96 countries are GATT members and are negotiating new multilateral trade accords in the so-called Uruguay round of GATT negotiations. The guiding principle behind the founding of GATT was the concept of free trade. By allowing goods and services to flow freely across national borders, each country could specialize in those activities it performed best. International trade would bring the world closer together, fostering understanding between nations. America would lead by example, a policy still advocated today.
The best that America can do is set an example by opening up our markets even more and looking at the record of places like Hong Kong and some of the other really successful free trade areas in the world and say, if you want to grow rapidly, the way you do that is open up your own markets. Sometimes I think perhaps we even ought to run TV advertising campaigns in places like Japan and say to the Japanese housewife, why are you paying 9 times the world price for rice? Why are you paying $35 a pound for beef that you could buy for $5 in the United States?
America's position in the international trading arena has changed dramatically since the first GATT agreement. As late as 1960, trade accounted for only 10% of America's gross national product. Today, it is more than twice that. 40% of America's farmland is planted with crops that will be exported. That means, for example, that America devotes more land to feeding the Japanese people than Japan does. 1 out of every 6 U.S. manufacturing jobs depends on foreign sales. And fully 70% of American industry now faces foreign competition. GATT was designed to set the rules among free trading, democratically inclined nations. But by some estimates, 75% of the world's business is now conducted under governments that do not share U.S. values.
It's a matter of fact that international commercial relationships are based on individual national interest, and that the United States should now finally understand that reality and begin to better reflect U.S. domestic interest rather than an outdated economic theory whose only validity probably rests in first-year economics in college.
For many American businessmen, the frustration of unfair practices abroad presents a quandary: how to balance a belief in free trade with the reality of today's trading regime.
The electronics industry has been in the forefront, I think, of trying to explain the importance of opening world markets. The difficulty is that you have no leverage. And the leverage that we have is access to the largest market in the world, ourselves. And you can't extol the virtues of open market without also providing some sort of a stick that you may not have an open market if yours isn't opened. And that's very difficult. It goes against our grain. We don't want to be accused in this industry of being protectionist. We don't want to be patsies, however.
You favor the Gephardt Amendment. Explain what it would do, and I take it that you agree with Congressman Gephardt that it's not protectionism, that it's a market opening lever.
What I advocate is, in effect, that we use our markets as a means to open other markets. What happens is we fail to make the distinction between closing your market to protect obsolete industries and unproductive workers and closing your market as a means to open other nations' markets.
It's a threat.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So the Gephardt Amendment is a threat to close our markets if... yeah, go ahead.
In strategic negotiations with the Soviets, we armed to parley. We don't seem to be willing to make that same sort of tough negotiating stance in our trade activities. Ultimately, we've got to ask a question. What other tool do we have to open foreign markets unless we're willing to deny them access to ours, unless we're really going to have a tit-for-tat relationship?
Mm-hmm. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I think the argument is dangerous economically and dangerous in every respect. It is protectionist. It makes the assumption, and is part of the amendment, that countries with which we are in deficit, those other countries have a surplus, and if they have unfair trading laws or practices, that each year they must reduce that surplus by 10%, or barriers on this side will be set up. I don't think that the barriers are that much of the surplus problem. So even if the barriers were removed, you're still going to have this bilateral deficit surplus problem, and then you're into setting up these quotas, which are protectionist.
Well, I think that Bill and others that object to the Gephardt Amendment really don't have anything to worry about, because the Gephardt Amendment is not going to be in the final trade bill. What I think is going to be there is the Senate version, where they, in effect, charge the U.S. trade representative to identify those countries that have a surplus and a consistent pattern of unfair trade practices, and then turn it back to the existing laws and structures. And so, in that sense, at least we're going to deal with it. So, I think that too much has been made of the Gephardt Amendment, to be very clear. But it's not to deny the fact that this country needs a different and a tougher approach to its trade relationships.
First, I think the Gephardt Amendment has become the monster from the swamp. Everyone who's interested in free trade, like I am, was told that the House Ways and Means Committee would take care of it. It was a silly thing, just a political gesture. They didn't take care of it. Then it was going to get taken care of on the House floor. It didn't get taken care of. 3 times it's been passed. Now this man's in the lead for the presidency, and we read in the papers that because he's in the lead, it's probably going to stick. I think that first you run this risk of people saying, oh, it's a throwaway vote, don't pay any attention to it. This is a seriously dangerous provision. We are now in a fledgling part of an export boom when our companies are getting their act together. This is the worst time to justify other countries retaliating against those companies that are getting export sensitive and export gifted.
Bill, if the Gephardt Amendment is not in there, will ABC support the bill?
I think there are so many things on top of the Gephardt Amendment. I think there are restrictions on foreigners investing in American companies, which I think are equally serious. I think
Bill, that's just not the case. No. That's just not the case. The Bryan Amendment is in the House version. It's
What's
not
the
in
Bryan Amendment?
The Bryan Amendment would, in effect, require foreigners to register when they buy certain types of American assets. It's not in the Senate. That's not going to pass. I think the key
you know, it's amazing for someone who's not voting that you know how many of these things that people think
Bill,
are terrible are not going to.
I'm saying if they're not there, do you support them?
Well, it is there. It is in the House bill, and I think it is terribly serious.
Let me ask this. Do you think that the President will veto the trade bill as it currently is if the Gephardt Amendment is taken out? In other words, does the White House enough of a free trade institution now that that the President will veto the bill?
Morton, everyone has been flummoxed from the first time when the Democrats said this was #1 priority, even before this Congress came together in December of the year. And no one has been able to predict when they would even start meeting as a conference. There are 190 people in this conference committee. That in itself is a record.
Let me just quickly say, it would be a great disaster for this country if this trade bill doesn't pass. I personally, for the following reasons. First of all of the legislation, all of the authority to have protectionist measures are already on the books. You need the trade bill so the President has the authority to negotiate liberalizing movements. That's one thing that is necessary. Secondly, if we don't have this bill, we will not have protection for our intellectual property rights, our copyrights, our patents, our technology, things that are important to your company. We will not have the ways and means to help our workers adjust to the displacement that is caused by these kinds of economic changes. We focus too much on the Gephardt Amendment and ignore the other really important measures that are contained in this bill.
Quickly answer that, but at the same time answer the question: shouldn't the President have more artillery to go into negotiations with foreigners in order to open up their markets?
Mort, I think that we are once again back beating this dead horse, claiming it's a dinosaur, an alive dinosaur, that the reason that we are in the fix we're in is because other countries are beating us up. And that is simply not true.
All right, let us drop that and go to the Choate agenda now. What you want to do is switch from the GATT, this international trading institution, which supposedly believes in free trade, to, as I understand it, bilateral negotiations with Canada, with Japan, with South Korea, with other countries, and establish our own individual trading arrangements with them. Now, are you talking about quotas?
No.
Or what is it that you're talking about?
No, absolutely not.
Talking about dividing up markets.
No, what I am talking about is this. We start off by a recognition that the GATT, even after 7 rounds of negotiations, today covers less than 7% of global commerce. That means 93% is done without rules. The other thing that we find is that there are 4 other types of economic systems in the world. They are not free trade economies. 75% of the trade is done by them. What I'm saying that we should do is negotiate agreements with those other economic systems, tailor those agreements to those particular types of systems, and the objective is not to promote free trade, the objective is to expand trade. That means you have a free trade agreement with the Canadians, who have an economy somewhat like ours. You have more managed trade agreements with the Soviets, which have a very tightly controlled economy, and then you tailor other agreements that'll fit the Japanese, which is different from the Mexican, which is different from the Brazilian. The objective is to expand trade.
What's wrong with that? Anything?
Well, I think there is an assumption, again here, that companies in the United States are trading with governments. Except for a few places like China and the Soviet Union, most of our trade is done with companies in other countries. And while they may be under a slightly different system, it's really company to company, company to customer. And to somehow impute to the trading laws the force of commerce is unrealistic.
Just quickly, one word or two word answer. Do you think that the Reagan administration has been effective in opening up markets for American firms?
I think that one of the most encouraging steps that has ever been taken among countries is the Canada-United States negotiations. I think second, the Mexican negotiations.
And what do you think of the Reagan record?
I think they've been as effective on trade policy as they have in balancing the budget.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Choate, very much for being with us. Mr. Lilly, for American Interests, I'm Morton Kondracki.
American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer Inc. and these leading foundations.